We can go. We've got a thumbs up. Good evening. Sorry, I was just checking my notes. And welcome to this evening's panel debate. I'm Sylvan Baker, and I am a researcher and lecturer at Central School of Speech and Drama. And I think I've been called into the room today because I'm doing research with young people with experience of the UK care system. And some of those young people have experience of being fostered and or adopted transracially. And I have my own care experience. I'm going to invite my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Savita. I'm Savita de Sousa, and I work for an organisation called Quorum Bath that produces some of the publications and tries to listen to the voice of young people in care, and also produces some research messages and does some training with professionals.
Hello, I'm Joseph Harker. I'm the Deputy Opinion Editor at The Guardian. My own background, which I've written about in the paper, is that I was, my mother's Irish, my father's Nigerian. My father sort of ran away as soon as he realised that I was on the way. And so I was brought up in Hull in East Yorkshire, which is a very white city. And my mother married a local white English guy, and so who adopted me. And I took his name, and I was raised with two white parents. So that's my forms my view of transracial adoption.
Hi, I'm Twayna Mayne. I'm a writer and a stand-up comedian. I'm also a transracial adoptee. I went into care at first, and then my foster mum, who is white, later adopted me and my brothers, and I was adopted when I was just before I was 15.
Brilliant, thank you. So, just to kick us off, what we're going to do is have a couple of questions and we'll go up and down the panel and hear different perspectives on it, and then there'll be like 10 or 15 minutes where you can ask questions and we'll see where that takes us. Is that all right? It's great that they've mic'd us up. I can almost touch you, we're so close, so we probably don't need one. So just to kick off the general conversation, in the light of everything that's going on, and I haven't yet had the privilege of seeing the show here, what do we think are the implications of being raised by parents who don't look like you? I should say from the outset that I went into care when I was 11 days old, and my foster parents were white, and I stayed with them for 20 years. So what do we think about, what's the impact? Is there an impact of being raised by people who, some people would say, they're clearly not your parents? Any thoughts?
For me, it's interesting. It's really interesting to be raised by people who you're not biologically related to. And as a black person being raised by a white parent, because my mum was a single mum as well, I just found it, the negatives for me were just basically just being stared at. That happened a hell of a lot, just people being stared at whenever we were out as a family. And then at school, people who are not my close friends asking questions and just basically just making assumptions as to why we were in that family and what had happened to us to become part of that kind of family dynamic. And that is just unpleasant and stressful, and it goes on for just most of your schooling until you decide that when it's parents' evening when you're 15, that I am no longer going to go to parents' evening with you. You're going to have to go around on your own. I cannot deal with this. This is just far too much. So yeah, that's one of the negatives. And then because my mum's from North Devon, we used to go to North Devon on holiday, and that is not very many black people. So whenever we turn up, it would instantly become, when me and my brothers turned up, it would instantly become like part of, we'd be like the biggest population of black people in the southwest. Yeah. It's kind of, do you know what I mean? All of a sudden, it was just, and I don't think my mum realised how stressful that was for us as young black kids to go from London, where we might be stared at as a family, but it was, sometimes you could get by. But if you go into a part of the country where there's not many people like you, and what that does to you. So yeah, it's not all, it's a bit much.
Joseph, you said that you were raised in the north. So does any of that chime with you, resonate for you?
Absolutely. It's this idea about kids at school talking about it, and I was the only black kid in my school. for much of the time, always the only black kid in my year. And the way that they will make assumptions about you and your background and tell stories about, oh, your dad this or whatever, your mum that. And for people who you don't even know, you've never shared anything with, but yet they're quite happy to share stories about you and rumours and everything else. And it feels really personal and quite distressing. Maybe my experience is different in that I was in a very white city, and that sort of brings its own differences. And I was born in the 60s and sort of raised in the late 60s and 70s, and you know, it was especially in a place like Hull, there were, you know, being black was a kind of real anomaly, and even though I'm mixed race, it was the kind of darkest thing they'd ever seen in their lives. And so there was very little knowledge about raising a black kid in that era, and you know, at the same time, you got the extreme racism from people at school. It felt like it went on for years. I don't know how many, whether it was weeks or months it went on for, but at every school playtime, as we call it in primary school, I was age 6, 7. There was my friends would form a circle around me and just shout, nigger, wog, nigger, nigger. And that was their sort of daily entertainment. And then I would then have this wall of people around me. And then I would go up to one of them, and then as soon as I went up to one kid, he'd go, oh no, sorry, I didn't mean it. And then the rest of the group would start chanting it, and then I'd go to the next one, and he'd do the same, didn't mean it. And it just carried on for like the whole of playtime or until they got bored with it or whatever. And this I should point out, was my friends. It wasn't people who I didn't know. This is my kind of circle of closest friends at the school. And it just became, and when I would talk to my parents about it, and again, this is a caveat, this was the late 60s, early 70s, they would just say, well, you know, just don't react, don't respond to it, and they'll get bored and it'll go away. And in a way of sort of coping, then that was, it possibly helped, because I would always be the one getting into trouble, because as the black kid, you're always the one getting into trouble, because of the response. You respond to them, and so if the teacher would see you going up and, you know, tackling a white kid, and there was always, in their eyes, you would always be the one who was being aggressive, and the teachers had no interest in what the kids were chanting, even though it was clear that they could hear it. But it was always just, you know, just ignore it, it'll go away. And there was never any sense of, it was always left with that sense that there's something wrong with you being black. You know, if you're quiet about it, maybe they won't notice, and don't, you know. I never got any sense of, and much as it's my mum, and I got a lot of love from my parents, there was never any sense that, oh, you're black, be proud of it. There's nothing wrong with being different. This just means you've got a different history, which is different to theirs, but it's just as good as theirs. And so I was left with this sense of just sort of inferiority, and thinking, well, if only I was white like the rest of them, this would go away. And so I still think, even though clearly times have changed and there's a lot more knowledge now about adopting black kids, I still think that there's something basic, which is about having a parent who looks like you is very important.
I think if I jump in my own experience, I was raised in the West Midlands, and I think the things that are difficult are that being in care makes you different enough. So things I remember about it as a child were being able to read the faces of predominantly the white neighbours and teachers and people around me as they changed gear when they realised that I was fostered by two white couple. When they came to collect me from something, and you could see the gear change, and there was a oh, and then sometimes there was a oh, if they realised, oh, well, they're going to pick you up. And so what we're talking about really is that additional labour that just is part and parcel of existence. And what chimes for me, what you just said, Joseph, is about, on the rare occasions that I would raise it with my foster parents about it being a pain in the arse, really, because one of the paradoxes of this is there was a lot of love in the house, a great deal of love in the house. And though I didn't have that same sense of not being proud of my identity, not being directly connected to it, not being tethered to it, made you feel othered, made one feel othered, made one feel strange, made one feel out of place, I think. And like you, I was the only black boy in my primary school in my year. And I think what I did I made it my business to know the punchline of every racist joke that was going around, so that if someone started to say the joke, I could say the punchline and kill it and take their thunder away from them. So I learnt hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And I think what it made me do is it made me read. I realised that I wasn't going to be able to fight all these people, so the thing I would need to do was to find some way to get one over on them. So I collected as big a vocabulary as I could. And when someone said nigger or something, I'd just say like a word with 15 syllables in, and then watch them and then go, you don't know what that means, do you? That proves how ignorant you are. Because I just couldn't fight. But when I started to reflect on it, I didn't necessarily feel that I needed to be white. But the question was about, does love, and I'm going to share this down the line, come to Vika in a minute, does love, where's the balance between love and cultural sociability, cultural connection? And I'm coming to you because of your expertise in this area.
Yeah, I mean, everything you've said still resonates today. It's still what we would talk about is what you said is families saying, oh, just ignore it, it'll go away. No, it won't. And so I think what we talk about today is having the skills and the competencies. We talk about cultural competence so that foster carers and adoptive parents can be trained in them. And that includes black adopters and black foster carers, because it's not something you're born with, but the experience of racism teaches you those coping mechanisms. And inevitably, it's always the issue about racism, which you face outside of the family. And all the stories that have been written so far by adopted people, black people, and those in foster care, is this bit about being different, that in the home, I'm loved, and then when I walk out of the door, I'm seen differently to my siblings. And this whole thing about how society sees us, which I know we're going to come on to, and that thing where racism then comes in. And the racism I experienced, I lived actually in Africa and was born in Nairobi in Kenya, but my experiences of still living within my birth family and coming here, I think my experiences of racism probably different to the experiences that each of you have individually had in terms of your childhood experiences. But we still need to equip adopters and foster carers with those skills. And they can be acquired, but some would argue, well, the black social workers and allied professions argue that you cannot beat the lived experience. It's more like a museum experience. So you can learn the skills, but if you never experienced the impact of racism and the kind of skills you develop to fight back, then you don't know what it's like. So it's still around today, sadly, sorry.
I think from the outset, we have to admit that we know that the culture we live in is extremely racist and also extremely exclusive. So it's looking for any particular wrinkle or difference or something that makes you not conform. So this question about love and this question about identity, where, if you're looking back on your, I suppose the way you were raised, where do you sit on it now?
I grew up with my older brothers. So in our house there was a family of 4, and there was 3 black children and 1 white mum. It's a black household, yeah. But it's not a black household. It's a black household with a white parent. It's quite unusual, but it was. I think what was important for us was that we stayed together as siblings. So there's the love there that we had before we went into care. I had got younger brothers, and because there was 5 of us, we couldn't all go to one family. So my younger brothers went to a different family, and they went to a white adoptive family as well, and their experience was very different from ours. Race wasn't spoken about at all. It's like we love, and their oldest was, their biological child was their eldest, and he was white, and then there was different different fostered and adoptive children in that family and from different ethnic groups, and it was like, we love you all the same, race is not important, it's not discussed. And that's really strange, because when you're born in the UK and you are not white, you know that you're not white because everybody else tells you that you're not white. So you need to acknowledge it. It needs to be acknowledged in the home. So then when you have, and then because I can see all this with my younger brother, like he questioned who he was, and so his parents just adopted another black child and said, look, there you go, you're not the only black one in this family, it's fine. And it's just like, that's not quite how you do it. But I think, to me personally, I've always been of the opinion that if you're going to take, who you are kind of racially and ethnically is as important as loving. That's part of loving you. You can't sort of say, we're not going to love that, we're not going to talk about that, because I don't think that, if you do that, that's not love. That's denying something, and I think that doesn't help.
So not talking about race is, in a way, not showing the care that loving care should be giving in a family. Yeah.
If you're going to compare one with the other, I'd say, for me, the most important thing a child needs is love. And that's, above all else, a child needs to be in a loving home. But if is love enough on its own, I would say no. And this has come up often in the debate about transracial adoption, where, there's the argument about black kids being lingering in foster care for years, or in care for years, while they're waiting for a perfect racial match. And I think that's crazy. I think they need to, if there is no black family, then I'd rather they were brought up in a loving white family than staying in care. But what the Tories have been doing in the last few years has been almost saying race doesn't matter at all, and they would just as much have a black kid in a white family as in a black family, and that is absolutely wrong. I think I guess I can say I've gone through and I can see that love is really important, and you can come through fairly reasonably if you've just had the love. But I think the race is a really important thing too, and if at all possible, have a child in a loving family with the same racial group. And obviously it's when you're black, we talk about transracial, and it's normally we're talking about black kids being adopted by white parents, which is the norm. And we don't talk, rather than talking about white kids adopted by black parents. And you can see, for all the media talk about how white parents should be able to adopt who they like and there should be no racial barriers. You saw the furore a couple of years ago when it was a Christian child adopted by Muslim parents, and you see how white people really feel about this when it's the shoes on the other foot, and that it does matter, identity does matter, the identity of the child is significant. And so I'm not a sort of an absolutist on this, but I just think wherever possible, same race definitely is a preferable option.
So same race wherever possible, but I think I would agree with you by saying that if it's the difference between languishing in care and going from placement to placement and potentially from home to home, then the thought of being with a family that will love you seems like the logical thing. And as I think about it now and thought about it growing up, I still think the same.
Yeah, because somebody who's in care, and because I sometimes this conversation comes up with friends of mine, and to me, the most important thing that happened to me and my brothers was that we went into care, and we went backwards and forwards a few times, and then there was a decision was made that we wouldn't go back to our birth mum. And once you know that your life is stable, when you've had chaos and lots of other things, then to me, that's as important as any. Do you know what I mean? That's part of love. Do you know what I mean? If you know that you're safe, you're stable, you're not going to have to deal with chaotic people and all the rest of it, that changes. So when people say like languishing in care, I don't even know what that means really. Because if my mum had not adopted us, we would have stayed with her. Do you know what I mean? It just the relationship just became formal and legal. So not saying that care is a, do you know what I mean? It's a fairy tale. Like care is better than being with you. It's not. But I don't know what sort of people have, what they think what being in care is about. Like it's better than maybe the option of where you were. But not that saying. I also don't agree that you should just stay in care because they can't find I just think kids need a kind of a permanent, loving home, and then sometimes there's other bits. And I always kind of, it's such a difficult thing to kind of say, yeah, I'm not an absolutist about this, and I've changed my mind about this over the years as well. Just kind of, it's such a difficult thing to get right as well.
It's interesting talking to social workers about this. In my research, we collect verbatim testimonies from young people with care experience, who then perform them to social workers, who then record their own testimonies, and we share the testimonies around, because the issue is about creating the best system of care that's available. And we find that because the verbatim testimonies makes everyone anonymous, the project is called the Verbatim Formula. We're going to the Department for Education on Thursday to talk to the Permanent Undersecretary for Children and Families. Suddenly, these social workers start talking about love. They don't talk about it in their work because of safeguarding and fear, and also because of the transition of caseload. So the young people talk about the fact that, irrespective of their identity, there are major elements of their cultural identity that they would like to hold on to. But irrespective of those, what they want is love and to feel cared for. And they hate the term care because it seems like an insult.
And that's currently everything you've said is the policy, really. Children, what we know from research is that children are best brought up in families, however we might define those families. And families include reunification with your birth family, or kinship, or what we call special guardianship, adoptions a bit way down the line. But we also know from research that if you have love, it's the secure base, it's the foundation on which you can then flourish. Like you said, you've got your basic needs. What we then need to do is to encourage adoptive families and foster carers start talking to their children about race and about identity rather than ignoring it. Love doesn't conquer that, and ATRAP, which was the Association of Adopted Adults, have said that. And in fact, everything you've said is what adopted adults are now saying in Polita Harris's book, In Search of Belonging, that Coram Bath published. The views are mixed. But most of the and all the research from Search and Reunion and the Chinese study, they all show that love really matters, that attachment to a caregiver in order for you then to explore your own identities really matters. But what they've shown is that there's something still missing, and it's that bit around that sense of belonging or that sense of fitting in. And what's usually happened now is because it's the mixed, the children that are most overrepresented in the care system are those of mixed ethnicity, and the ethnicities are varied, and we're quite multicultural communities. And it's those children then that don't know whether they fit in with the white or the black community, and they get into adulthood. Maybe I'm jumping the discussion, but I'll leave it at that. That's the research, that love doesn't conquer, but it is the secure base, as we would call it, really. Yeah.
So love doesn't conquer, but it creates the secure base. And then what we've been talking about is kind of the other extra sociabilities that fit around that love and around that creation of identity. And this might be a really interesting time to open the floor to questions. Sometimes in these events there's people running around with microphones, but I think we're so compact and bijou here, we can just speak, and I'm sure we can hear you. And I'll relay stuff if people can't. So does anyone have a comment, an observation, or a question that they'd like to share with the rest of the room? Yes?
So how do we tell foster carers if they're not African or Afro-Caribbean that they need to give that information, they need to give that access to a young person, and especially if that foster family is in somewhere rural or up in the north, where you don't get the mix of cultures and ethnicities that you might get in a place like London. How do we tell the foster carers that they need to do that?
It should be part of the assessment process. So when you get assessed to be a foster carer or adoptive parent, you go through quite a rigorous stage. And one of the things you learn about is child development. One of the things you learn about is what are the needs of the child. So it's knowing the whole profile of the child. The other thing is that usually in foster care, unless there are safeguarding issues, there's contact. And contact would mean links with your siblings or your birth family, if appropriate, all of that. So that's
very bizarre family background.
all right. So contact is part of the way your life story continues, and so you should really have a life story book that tells you all about your links and your heritage, and be proud of.
You're saying this is part of the trend. So my parents fostered, but my mum is actually my half sister from my dad's first
Right.
marriage. So then they are my family, but I grew up with my white family. They did end up fostering, so I know all of these things. But what's always been quite bizarre for me is my family were foster carers, but they weren't told those things. They didn't receive that kind of training.
Yeah, I hope it's going to change, but we've still got a long way to go.
That was the
That's
question I was,
part of
Yeah.
the thing.
that was the question I was going to ask. You know, it may be that in London and there's some more where people are used to
Yeah.
that, but I'm just wondering somewhere like the northeast or whatever, where there is a lot less racial diversity, whether
Yeah.
those things are actually happening.
They should happen. You should be assessed about that. You should be encouraged to go to support groups. They should receive support from their social workers. They should receive training. You should receive the issues around cultural competence. That ability to be able to communicate and listen to the young person and what's going on. One of the things that research showed was that because of love, a lot of young people didn't want to rock the boat, so they wouldn't tell their parents the kind of experiences you've experienced and talked about in school. And so when they'd come home, they wouldn't say anything because they were so worried about losing their adoptive family. They were happy, but then when they grew up into adulthood, they were really lonely. And these are the kind of messages we need to convey. It is an uphill struggle, but it's where we should be going, which is about training, which should begin with the assessment, should begin with the needs and the planning for the child, and they should be assessed on their competency. But it's also about learning how to communicate and not being afraid to talk about, rather than ignore it, to actually talk about what it means when you walk outside and when you see yourself as being different and how you feel.
I think that's the issue, isn't it?
And I was going to say that's a good point, because when the media report it, they talk to children and say, oh, but children say there's no problem at all, everything's fine, they don't mind who their parents are. And it's only when you're older and you realise what you've missed out on, and you reflect, and the things that you might have just held in when you're younger and you couldn't express, it's only then that you realise, actually, that was going on, and that's why I never, you know.
Yeah, because children are in a different thing, you're right. When you get into adulthood, you're able to express yourself. Children are expressing themselves through the work that you're doing and the work that you've done. And we need to listen more to the voices of children and young people. So it's a work in progress, I hope. But there is a lot to be done in rural areas, yeah.
Would it not also be true that you need to facilitate, and I'm a psychotherapist and I work with adoption.
Sorry?
I'm a psychotherapist and I work with adoption.
Oh, right, yeah.
That you help the foster carers and the prospective adopters and adopters to listen.
I think we may be missing yes, but I think we may be missing a fundamental point here. And the fundamental point is that there is an issue, and that there should be some dialogue and conversation about the fact that this is a material thing. People will look at you and read you differently because of your identity location. And so as potential carers, the conversation has to happen. And then the support systems and the transactive structures that sit around it can kick in, because otherwise it's an elephant in the room. My experience of care, I remember those 70s posters that says love has no colour. It does have a colour. And erasing that colour is almost as damaging as that explicit racism that I remember experiencing as a younger person. So I think it's having the openness and the curiosity. The young people that we're talking to at the moment are talking about really small things like food and hair products. They're the things that are pathways into their identity. And loving going on, I'm working with the Children in Care Council in a local authority, and one of the reasons where the support staff who also are care experienced organise residentials is so that the kids can do each other's hair. They don't actually want to go mountain climbing, they want to sit in a room and talk and watch TV and have lots of the correct products to do their hair, because that's one of the linkages to identity. And it seems like a small thing, and it seems like something that oh well, I'll just go and get the stuff. But if you don't know, you don't.
But I think one of the things also is that foster carers and adopters haven't thought about their own identities. They haven't begun to talk about how does your family change when you came into that family, and what does it mean? Adoption's a whole new identity. Being in foster care is a whole new identity. That issue about loss and separation and what it means for your identity and for your pride and how you feel about yourself. I think it's that ability to be able to talk about it and just open up those discussions, and maybe they're fearful. And what does it mean to be an adoptive family? How does it change you? How did you change your families? What impact did they have on them? I'm sure it was beneficial. I'm sure it was great. But when did that last get spoken to? You know, or did they talk to you about that? And that's what I think we tried to do through. Well, hopefully you tried to do it through your work, but that's what we tried to do with adopters and foster carers today, is listen to the voice of the child, listen to the voice of the adult who's been through that experience, and what messages can we take from that. But that confidence to be able to speak. I know there was somebody who said to me, I've got a 13-year-old, and he's wonderful, everybody loves him in this village in a rural area, and he's like, you know, the pride of the village, except that when he looks in the mirror, I don't know what he sees as the foster carer to me, because I know he's black and I don't know how to talk about it. And I said, well, what does your social worker say? And she said, oh, she doesn't know. She says, we've all come on the course with you today, you know, to talk about it. So I think it's about giving people permission and the confidence to be able to talk about it. To be honest, I think that should begin at the assessment stage, and that's where I keep putting it back to what are the needs of the child, what are the expectations of the child that you'll be caring for.
I think it's becoming more and more apparent right across education for children that sex and relationship education suddenly is a thing and suddenly is on the agenda. So dialogue needs to happen about this. Before I take another question, any other comments? Right, another question.
I guess my interest is like wider social and political context that all of this happens within, and who tells in a society, as you say, which is a racist society where not all stories are heard, not all stories are told, let alone listened to. I was interested from your own lived experience. Are your stories being told? Do you want them to be? If so, why? You know, we're sitting here in a talk that's happened because of white playwright written a play written by a white person about this experience. There's a slight irony there, personally. But my question isn't about the play, it's about the wider context. And who is telling these stories? Are they being told? And do they need to be, and who should be telling them?
I'm telling my own story. So a couple of years ago, I went to Edinburgh with my show called Black Girl, and it was about me being adopted and just how I found my own identity through popular culture, because I was looking for black role models and I was immersed in American culture, as we all are, and I was kind of, it didn't quite sit with me, but I was kind of like, yeah, this is all I'm getting, really. We're kind of an offshoot of America. So now I went to America in my early 20s, and it was only when I was in America that I realised that I was British. Like, I'm actually a British black person, and that's very different. I'm a European black person. That's very different from being a black American. So I'm all about sort of black British stories being told by black Britons, and whatever that story is. So yeah.
I think we're really obsessed by the Americans.
Yeah, but everybody is. That's the thing. It's everybody is.
And these issues aren't really issues in the States, so they tend not to be talked about because they're not American, they're not sexy, there's not Hollywood movies about it. So, and I think in terms of who's doing the talking, I mean, I think, you know, it came out, and I wrote this piece, it's a few years ago when the Tories were changing their policies on transracial adoption. And unfortunately, even if we are telling our stories, there's a sort of massive stories telling, giving another perspective, saying, you know, race doesn't matter. Basically, white parents should be able to adopt who they want, when they want, and no one should stop them. And that is the way the stories were told from our politicians to the media, the messages that go out, and it's very difficult. I wrote one piece at the time. I don't know there was another piece in any other newspaper about this issue from a black perspective at the time when it was sort of dominating the news agenda a few years ago. So I think it is very difficult for us to sort of make space, and maybe among the social work profession, there's, you know, people have a lot more knowledge about it, and maybe people carry on just doing what they're doing regardless of what the politicians, the national politicians are saying. But it does worry me because, you know, and the Times in particular has had a sort of a campaign about this, and you know, and so the whole idea seems to be, oh, you know, race is unimportant, and the people, it's kind of these race warriors are the only people who have any concern with it, and who are they, these kind of hard left, whatever. And it does worry me that seeps down, and this sense of entitlement that white parents have about being able to adopt whichever brown baby they want. That worries me.
I think it sits within two things. One of the other people I know who's very prominent doing this is Lem Sisse, is talking about this a lot.
Yeah, he does.
And connecting to other organisations and other and younger and older people to talk about it. I think that's one thing. I think that unfortunately it may get obscured by the whole discourse around care. One of the young people I was working with very recently still talks about Tracy Beaker. You know, they say that people who don't know about care, when they ask someone with care experience about care, they tend to say, "Is it like Tracy Beaker?"
But I got asked if I was a Bernardo's child when I was at school. It's like when we used to raise money for Bernardo's homes, like we're raising money for you. Like, I'm not a Bernardo's child.
No.
I didn't grow up in an institution. I didn't,
No.
guys. I live in a house. Do you know what I mean? It's just like,
But there are long trajectories of what care will be. If you look at how care is spoken about generally in the press, you hear about crime rates, homelessness, mental illness. Yeah, sometimes stuff about access into further and higher education. But there is still a strong discourse that says care means bad and means we'll end up in a bad way and is the navigator of a future. And I think within that, ethnic identity within care gets lost. And it's clearly an issue.
And what gets, it's related, yeah, it's absolutely, because I think what transracial adoption does is locates us within a multicultural society, but the government, as he said, doesn't quite equate with multiculturalism, because the politicians or policy thinks that it hasn't worked and we've become segregated into our own communities, so transracial adoption might be the solution. What we need is a balanced approach, really, which is that we still need to recruit Black, Asian and mixed ethnicity adopters and foster carers. That there isn't so much noise about that, but we do. We still promote that. Agencies are trying very hard still to promote that and to recruit appropriate foster carers and adoptive parents from different communities. And so this is a call today for that we do need foster carers and adopters from all communities. And it is about taking a balanced approach. It is about, you're saying children do need families in which to grow up with, but they need a group of diverse families. What's really interesting is how successful the LGBT community have been in recruiting adopters and foster carers. And people say to me, so why aren't the Black communities coming forward? And therein maybe lies those issues about poverty, unemployment, have I got a spare room, all of those issues. And that's why transracial adoption, in a way, perhaps it's easier to talk about adoption in some of those stories because it brings us into the wider issues of what's going on in policy and society today.
I'm aware that we've got 4 minutes left. So we can maybe take 2 more questions. And if we take them both together, then we've got a fighting chance of answering at least one of them. So 2 more questions. One from here.
Yeah, I work in adoption and I'm a social worker, and I do deal with recruitment, and I just want to echo what you're saying, is that we are interested in families able to promote the needs of children, but we do strongly call out for Black families, mixed families, as I said, to come forward. So that for me is just something that I'm keen to get across to my
So more Black families need to come forward. We've got 1 slot for a question. I can see it's there, isn't it? Yeah.
My question is, how do you feel your parents, you've talked about how you felt being brought up by your parents, but have you ever spoken to your parents about how you feel and what their feedback to you is? How it's for them to bring children up in what would be, I guess, 16, 17, or maybe with less support from the social services and counsellor?
I've kind of spoken to my mum a bit about it.
Sorry,
No, it's fine. I sort of talk about this quite a lot, actually. Because she's not from London, and I've kind of asked her why she kind of fostered and how we ended up kind of with her, and she was kind of like, well, I didn't plan to adopt anybody. I just wanted to foster some children, because I wanted to foster some children, and she had a little black boy just before she got us, and then she got my younger brothers first, and she just thought they were brilliant, and she thought they needed a family, and then she realised I was out there, so she got me as well, because she was like, siblings need to be together, and because my younger brothers are twins, so they were together anyway. So she was kind of like, I just think she was just happy to just have a family that needed a parent and just needed a stable home. And she was kind of quite right on, and so she was kind of, it was important for us to be in London, even though she kind of did think about moving out of London. She did kind of think it was important for us to be in the city that we were born in, surrounded by people who looked like us and different people with different colours. Do you know what I mean? A diverse community. She thought it was important. That was important.
Joseph.
Interesting question. I've told my mum a little bit about it, normally off the back of if I've written about it, but and just checking, are you okay with me writing this and me saying this? And it's a difficult subject because I don't blame my mum at all for anything. Yet, if you start talking about issues or problems you had, it might seem as if you're somehow criticising them, and I wouldn't want to do that. I didn't mention my mum's Irish, so in the sort of 60s, she was in that sort of absolutely in that no blacks, no Irish, no dogs era. That she was an outsider in her own right as well at the time, because she was mimicked for her accent, and so she was an outcast, which is possibly what attracted her to my father. It's a difficult subject, and I've tended to steer clear of it, which doesn't mean, and there's so many things that she gave me as a mother that that have to be so grateful for that. I've tended not to.
I've got to jump in before I get front of house manager having to hurt me. I would say just one sentence. My mum, when I spoke to her about it, talked about the responsibility and the guilt and the knowledge that that there was a challenge, but that her aspiration was about hope and love. And the one thing that has buoyed me up through this conversation this evening is that we've talked about love a lot, because it's not often talked about in the same sentence as care. I would love to talk to you for much longer, but we have to clear the stage because there's some kind of show on.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
And of course I'm going to say it, don't I? But we do also have listened to adopters and foster carers. If you want to hear more, go to the Coram Bath website. Really, thank you.
So it's an ad for the website. If you're interested in my research, it's called the Verbatim Formula. There's a website, I'm sure you can look it up.
I've got a podcast called the Loco Parentis podcast, which is Loco Parentis podcast. It's just speaking to adults who've been fostered or adopted.
And I think Joseph works for some magazine or something.
I don't have anything to plug, sorry.
No, you have
So I'm sure you
written,
can see his
I've read some of your stories in The Guardian.
As have
Yeah.
I. I'm waiting for them. I'm getting the death stare through the door. We have to stop. Yeah. Thank you very much.